Welcome to The Homeless Conservative. I am Blake Fisher. Thank you for joining me. Today, I'm talking to Patrick Brown about the opioid crisis. Specifically, we talk about how opioid and fentanyl overdoses are honestly affecting more prime-age men than any other demographic. Little history on Patrick Brown. He's a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where his work focuses on developing a robust pro-family economic agenda and supporting families as the cornerstone of a healthy and flourishing society. His writing has been published in the New York Times, National Review, Politico, The Washington Post, and USA Today, and The Dispatch, which is where I found him specifically on this article about opioids. And he has spoken on college campuses and Capitol Hill on topics from welfare reform to child care and education policy. You can find Patrick on the app formerly known as Twitter, now X, at PTB Writes, and I'll link to the articles that originally kicked off this conversation in the show notes, so you can check them out there. Here's my conversation with Patrick. Patrick Brown, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Blake.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about a couple articles, one of which I saw in the Dispatch, where you talked about specifically Netflix's new, I guess, sort of dramatized historical fiction, probably a little more fiction than history, you know, as you have to do with any of these things. I love the based on true events kind of precursor for movies and TV shows that we see. But you were talking about that specifically and kind of how we got here in the opioid crisis. Like a few quick numbers that you had. I think we're now at 112,000 or so drug overdoses a year now, and I think it's the leading cause behind heart disease and cancer now for deaths. So this is a huge problem. It's just gone up every year, and it seems like 2020 really kind of blew the problem up a little bit more. And so how did we get here from what you see?
Yeah, I mean that is a question we're all asking, and you're right. Netflix kind of and answered it their own way. And it's a fun show. Matthew Broderick stars as the CEO of Purdue Pharma, which produced OxyContin. We can talk about sort of what they got right and what we got wrong later. But you're right. I think the opioid epidemic was something that had a slow burn. It's the quote. There's a quote, I forget who it comes from, about a bankruptcy being gradually and all at once. And I kind of feel that's the same with opioid epidemic, where you saw the numbers slowly rising over the late 90s, early 2000s. And then boom, by 2013, 2014, it really started to take off in states, like West Virginia, Appalachia being the sort of canonical hotbed of a lot of this stuff, but not limited to there by any means. And this, Rust Belt states, especially, even New England, Oregon, California, they all started to see growth in drug overdoses. And so, for the last couple of years, we've been at six figures, 100,000 Americans or more dying of accidental overdoses. Today, that's mostly fentanyl, and that's being trafficked across the southern border. It's a very potent, powerful substance, makes it really difficult to do anything about legally, because one little Ziploc baggie of fentanyl can be enough product to, basically supply the market for a whole community. And trying to find that, when you're crossing the border now is, like looking for a needle in a haystack. If that haystack was, every cargo truck that goes through, the checkpoints between the U.S. and Mexico. So it's a devilishly tricky problem to solve now. And, the question you raised is, well, is there anything we could have done to prevent us from getting to this point? What are the sort of policy failures, or were there, other forks in the road we could have taken? I think, there are drug overdose increases in Europe, but they're not nearly to the same scale as the U.S. has experienced. So what's been unique about us? What have we done, or what have we not done? And so, again, the story that the Netflix series tells is based on a couple books that really pin the blame on Purdue Pharma, which produced OxyContin. And I do think that is a part of the story, but by now, I think looking at them and saying, well, they're the reason why, I think that's a little facile, right? A little, people are looking for easy villains because
it's a little simplistic.
And so we're trying to figure out what do we do? And that's what I've been trying to write about, and trying to figure out, how much blame do we allocate to those, drug makers in the 1990s, and what's gone wrong in the culture today that we might be able to reverse or put the genie back in the bottle.
Yeah, and I know, like, you say going back to the '90s, and that's interesting because that's when this first kind of became a thing. I had I had a pastor at our church growing up in the early 2000s, maybe 2004, something like that. That it turned out he was addicted to painkillers, and it was the normal situation. Like, fell off a roof. I mean, like, I guess falling off a roof's not the normal situation, but he had an injury to his neck,
Yeah.
needed them legitimately, and then became addicted to them, and then it kind of spiraled out of control from that. And he didn't die from it, but I mean, just the addiction kind of thing, and all that comes along with that. And then my wife's mom, her whole life was addicted to painkillers for the same thing. Had a back surgery when she never remembers her not being on painkillers, and she eventually died of an overdose of those painkillers. And so obviously, I think that most of us knew someone like that early on, like over the last 20 years, and then now it's turned into 14-year-olds searching for an Adderall on TikTok, and they buy something that's laced with fentanyl and they die. And
Yeah.
to me, it just seems like a much scarier part because, as you mentioned, the lethal dose of fentanyl. I mean, I'll put a picture up if you're watching it on YouTube or Spotify, but it is like compared to a penny, like a penny just engulfs the amount of fentanyl you have to die of an overdose. And so you mentioned like trying to find it coming across the southern border is like a needle in a haystack. But I've read some stuff that says, I mean, it's more like a needle in a stack of needles because these quantities are so, they need so little of it that they don't really care if even 60% of it gets confiscated at the border necessarily, because they can get by with the rest. It's just so little amounts that we need to kill people. I mean, I think the DEA seized enough in one raid last year. I'll have to find the source on that, but to kill everyone in the United States. I mean, it was like enough that would kill everyone. And so it seems really hard to stop that amount of and it's a chemical too. So it's not like heroin or cocaine where there's a plant, it's can only grow in certain places and you have to grow it. You have to have large crops. These are being, built in warehouses in the middle of industrial places in China, like, that are the size of
Right.
my house or something. It doesn't need a lot of space. So it just seems like a really hard to think, but I do want to think about like causation and stuff. Cause you mentioned Purdue Pharma, and obviously I think that there was certainly, some things that they did that were wrong. But I guess the thing I'm wondering about, because I like the angle you took, is in another article that you linked to in that Dispatch article about, how this is clearly an epidemic of single men specifically. So talk a little bit about that and like what you've found in who's the demographic of being affected by
No, I
this
think it's
currently.
interesting you talk about, the sort of canonical cases that we hear, the guy falling off the roof or the person recovering from back surgery. And I'm sorry to hear about your mother-in-law. But
Yeah, thanks.
those were the cases in the 1990s that I think got policymakers originally interested in what was going on with this drug, because Purdue and other, it wasn't just Purdue. I mean, they're the trendy bad guy to hate, but Johnson and Johnson, other big medical companies were in on this too, trying to figure out how do we treat this problem of chronic pain. This was a big focus in the 90s. The WHO released a big report saying freedom from pain should be a universal human right, and we need to do more to address. And again, I don't want anyone to suffer from chronic pain. I think it's a good thing to try to figure out a solution to. But the problem was there had been this traditional sort of fence around opioid derived products, right? Things that come from the poppy seed, basically. And there has always been this taboo, opium, heroin, that we knew that this was really powerful stuff. And what Purdue did that I
Yeah.
think kind of kickstarted this, and this is why they get all the blame, is saying, look, we found a way to administer this in a way that's not going to create dependency, not going to create an addiction. They called this, it's going to be the opioid you start with and you stay with, because it's safe, it's non habit forming, and they were wrong. They were basing it on faulty science.
Yeah.
They were probably lying, or at least
At one point, they definitely were, right? I mean, we know that at some point they knew that it was not the case, and they weren't they like telling doctors to basically like, no, you just prescribe more then or something, and basically like they were lying to the doctors, and the doctors were believing them, and it was just this
and they would
bad
cite
cycle.
some study that turned out to be a footnote to a letter to the editor in a medical journal, and it's like a lot of stuff where the line between sort of willful disbelief and actual outright lying can get blurry. But the point is, they were clearly trying to push this idea that they found this magic pill, and for a while it seemed like they had, and
Yeah.
then it turned out that it was very easy to abuse. People, I won't go into the whole details, because it's a fascinating story. There's some great books on it, but it became very evident by the early 90s. People were holding congressional hearings in 2002 that this was causing problems, and it took until
Yeah.
2018, I think 2017, 2018, for them to finally stop aggressively marketing the drug because the PR had gotten so bad. And the question
Right.
you raise is, okay, well, who was this most impacting? It started with construction workers, high school athletes, people who were being prescribed this for nagging chronic pain, and quickly became just sort of the most popular drug on the streets. People could go get a prescription, often subsidized by Medicaid if you're eligible for that, turn around and sell it for $1,000 a pill, for a serving or whatever, and make a lot of money. It crowded out a lot of other illegal drugs and became very popular because it was very effective. And there's actually stories of when people would OD, unfortunately, on either illicit oxy or even fentanyl when that's coming in. Other people addicted to drugs would kind of use that as a sign, like, oh, that's a really good product, right? We know that this is really effective. And it's unlike other substances. It is a drug that you take to numb the pain, and it's not alcohol. You're not having it to have a good time, right? It is a drug that you take when you're lonely, or in the words of Angus Deaton and Ann Case, it's a drug of despair. That language is kind of, gets kind of overblown sometimes, but it is something that you take when you feel like your life is you want to numb the pain, right? As I say. And so when you break it down, it's probably no surprise that it's most likely, as we've tracked the data over the last decade, the highest increase and the highest prevalence of drug-related deaths are among men, and among men, single and divorced men. And I think, my argument is that these are the guys who are, unfortunately not involved in community life, maybe fringe, workers, people who are sort of marginally attached to the labor force, but working a blue-collar job, certainly in the wake of the Great Recession, didn't have a lot of great prospects. They don't have a family, or they're not connected to their family, and they're really susceptible to this kind of thing because they don't have those shock absorbers, those airbags, to stop in and say, hey, look, you've been relying on this a lot. Shouldn't we think about trying to scale back or something? And they're just falling into this. Now, again, by this point, the people who that sort of initial cohort of people who got hooked on oxy and maybe turned to more aggressive drugs, I think it's pretty well known now, right? That this is a problem. People aren't prescribing it anymore. But now just flood of the marketplace. And to your point, it's been sort of a success story of capitalism in a sense. The producers are becoming more efficient. The market is growing. Obviously it's a terrible product, but it's really cheap now. And it's a really difficult policy problem to solve because markets are incredible tools. Unfortunately, it's just producing a really societally deadly product.
And so you mentioned like single men and stuff, and I like this chart that I'll put up on the screen for when this is actually edited and released. But where you actually compared like the okay, obviously there's all sorts of other things that come along with being married. Like, generally you are college educated a lot of times, and generally you have higher income. And so you adjusted like for that too. And it's still just overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly male, obviously, even when you're just looking at singlehood between men and women. And so, I mean, do you think, do you have any ideas of why it's so male? I mean, because you would think that, maybe we'd see the same thing with single women, but maybe single women just all have that friend community around them, or, I don't know. It just seems like such a, didn't know if you have any theories on the causation of it being so overwhelmingly male.
I think there's pretty good data to suggest that drug abuse tends to skew male in general. Men are sort of more risk-seeking in general. To your point, I think the sort of, to the extent there's a crisis of loneliness or a lack of friendship, I do think that sort of heavily concentrates on males. And so if you're a guy who's working a blue collar job and you go home and you open a beer and, you're not hanging out with your friends after work or something, the sort of Robert Putnam bowling alone type deal. I think there's obviously something to that, makes you more susceptible. There are obviously a lot of them are working more manually, intensive manual labor, sort of intense jobs. And so they're going to need more sort of medication. But again, it's sort of like suicide is traditionally a male coded trend that we see, and I think drug abuse in general appeals to people who are I, again, you don't want to overly stereotype here, but they're it's not people who are out having a good time, right? It's people who really feel like they
Right.
don't have anything else to lose, and this is a way of sort of taking the edge off the empty apartment at night. And again, I don't want to overly poeticize it. It's an awful reality, but it is just a way of trying to fill that void. And if you're not filling it with community or family, or a job that you feel like you're making progress in and have some sort of meaning you're deriving from, it makes sense why this would be something that you would be more susceptible to. Now, again, a lot of single guys without, don't fall into this, and I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but it is, again, controlling for education and marital status and race and all that stuff. It is a significant predictor. And I think that the conversation around drug abuse needs to focus on that and to say, look, this is as much a crisis of meaning and community as it is about technology and biomedical advances, right? When we're talking about how to solve the problem, we need to be having that in mind.
Well, I think the meaning part is really important because it's not, I don't think it's just that I think the stat, I think I saw something that's like 25% of men who are 40 or under are not married. Like, I mean, that's just kind of crazy to think of how high that number is, especially like just the marriage rate's going down. But it's not just the marriage thing, because you even controlled for like men who had been divorced. And obviously, I'm going to guess if you've been married and even if you divorce, like you probably have some community, like maybe you're in church, maybe you've got a bowling league, a softball, like, but I think most of those institutions have just kind of slowly disappeared from American life. And so, we don't have whatever Shriners and like I said, bowling leagues and whatever book clubs. I mean, I guess that's more of a female thing generally, but all those kind of things that have like community and meaning, that there's no regulation, there's no law that we can have, there's no like program we can do necessarily. I mean, and so I think the overlap between suicides and this that Venn diagram, that's got to be a pretty like big overlap between like the despair of like people that are, the most of the suicides, you're right, are men. And that's always been the case, but it's obviously shot up significantly, especially like men in their 40s and 50s, most of them divorced or single, and whether they have a job or not, they just don't have they don't have community. And so it makes it really hard to solve that problem, obviously, because I can't force people to be in community. Like from a top down situation, obviously that's just something we can do with the people we see around us, but it does make it really hard to prevent. And it seems so often that when these things happen, especially like I mentioned my mother-in-law and my father-in-law too. So, I mean, her husband too. So they both died of opioid overdoses. And so that was obviously really personal to us, but it feels like everyone we know at this point has someone they know that's died of an overdose. It feels like, and that just seems, I don't know. It feels like we're not really doing much I know there's some really complicated stuff with how this is manufactured in China. And I know China's been trying to kind of couple that with other geopolitical stuff. And when we don't play ball with that, they kind of like, well, we're not going to really enforce shutting these things down. And it seems like they're kind of using it as not a carrot, as a stick. I mean, as sort of like, oh, well, we're just going to keep sending this stuff your way. And it is mostly being manufactured in China, or at least the precursors for it, and then sent to either via mail or, that's the other crazy thing. It's just being shipped in the mail to Canada and the US and Mexico, and then sometimes being finished in Mexico and then coming up with the southern border. But just seems like when there's so much of it and they're not trying to crack down on it in China, and then we've got a loneliness epidemic going on, that And you mentioned it's a lot of, like, you started Appalachia and West Virginia and stuff like that, but it's obviously crept through the rest of the country. And you specified that, some of the states that kept the stricter kind of fences in place of, no, we really need to, like, make sure that, like, you just had some extra steps where doctors these pill mills couldn't show up and stuff. But I mean, even those ones eventually kind of laxed those fences,
yeah,
right?
that's true. But even today, they still have lower rates. I mean, delaying the onset. So, you just for the benefit of some of your listeners, the idea was that a lot of states in the wake of the sort of original opioid epidemic, with opium and heroin back in the 20s and 30s, sort of jazz age, people getting hooked on this. Some states, or actually a lot of states, and some of them ended up rescinding them, but it introduced this idea of, if you are a doctor prescribing one of these substances, you had to fill out a form. One copy would go to the physician to the patient to take to his or her the person who fills the drug, pharmacist. Thank you. Yeah,
Pharmacy,
one person
yeah.
would stay with the doctor's office, and one would go to the state, and it would go in a warehouse somewhere. Nobody was really going through these, but just the knowledge that if someone wanted to, someone in some state office could go through and say, "Hey, look, this guy's prescribing more, opioid-related substances than there are people in his town. Something's going on." Just that knowledge alone meant that states like California and some other states had lower prescription rates to start with, and they've stayed at lower rates ever since, because they looked at other states and say, "Hey, this is not working." So to me, that's a really interesting story of how you set the status quo matters. And when sort of that G.K. Chesterton line about, when you come to a fence in the forest, you should always understand why it was built before you take it down, right? And I think states kind of went through and say, "Well, look at all these old-fashioned regulations. We're much more enlightened now. We don't need these guardrails." And it turns out we did. And just because industry comes to a regulator and says, "We've got this miracle drug," doesn't mean there aren't any side effects that aren't going to show up years down the line. Having a little bit more of a Burkean approach sometimes, a little gradual and incrementalist, can avoid some of this heartache down the line. Now, you talked about sort of sources of meaning, and I kept waiting for you to bring up what I think is probably, I don't want to hinge everything on this explanation, because obviously a lot of church-going adults have gotten hooked to opioids. But I think when you're talking about the crisis of meaning for, younger single men, I don't think it's any accident that this is the demographic that has seen church-going attendance drop off the fastest. These guys are not, again, if you're not married and you're not, you don't have a college degree, just statistically, you're much more likely to not be part of a religious community today than you were in the past. And I think, again, that's another key form of sort of social integrations, people watching out for you, people checking up on you, people recognizing if your behavior starts shifting or something like that, that you can't replace with the market. You can't replace with any sort of policy intervention, right? This is impossible to backfill. So again, you to your point, you can't wave a magic wand and have people go back to church at the rates they used to, but it is a real consequence of these cultural changes. And while I certainly would never say that, like, churches should launch a PR campaign saying, "Come to church and your risk of dying from opioids will be less," I don't think we should be ashamed of saying, "Hey, look, this is another way of recognizing that for some people, they need that accountability, they need that partnership, that fraternity in their lives." And churches need to do a better job of trying to tell that story and trying to figure out ways to talk to those guys, because they're the most at risk right now.
I think also welcoming people in. I mean, in church specifically, I think there's obviously, there's a stigma with any kind of drug use, I think, in a lot of society anyway. But maybe we're not doing a good enough job of being like, "No, you're welcome here. Like, be messed up. That's great." And it's very clear that the decline in church going and religion. I think you can't look at it and not. I'm a Christian and I go to church all the time, but I don't understand how even someone that isn't religious can't look at that trend line and all the things that have come along with that lower, like I said, meaning and community, because people are still searching for that. They're just searching for it in other things that they don't find. There's no, politics has kind of become a lot of people's new religion, and it's not gonna, there's nothing very hopeful or very like positive about, it's really just about kind of hating another side or something, whichever side you end up on. It becomes more about like kind of hating that, and like that's just not healthy either. And so I think we end up going down this kind of it seems like there's only one way it ends, for that kind of stuff. I mean, so I'm curious, do you think without the opioid kind of like, Purdue and John's, all that kind of like, stuff that happened 90s into 2000s, do you think we'd still be where we are? Because like, I don't think that was obviously the cause for the loneliness epidemic. And so do you think we maybe still end up here even without them being the bad guy?
That is, I think, $1 million question. And, I think everybody's sort of trying to grapple with this. Now, as I mentioned, Europe they've seen a rise in drug related deaths, but not to the same exponential growth that we have. So I think but also Europe's a different, they've been sort of had much lower rates of religiosity for a while now. And so, maybe they're not a direct comparison. I don't know. It's impossible to know, but I do think that it's like, if you see someone, ready to jump off a bridge, are you giving them a push, or are you trying to pull them back over the fence and bring back to safety? And I think the introduction of these like basically technological advances and really potent pain-killing drugs were in a sense a little bit of a helping hand to say, hey, look, if you've had this existential pain in your life, here's a way of sort of papering over the problem rather than trying to address the root cause of a lot of people who are dealing with chronic pain have other things going on too, right? They have a crappy job, they don't have a good relationship with their family, and that sort of physical pain is almost it's correlated with a lot of other underlying causes. If there wasn't a sort of technological answer to say, here's some way of ignoring some of these root causes. Again, I don't know. I definitely think we would have seen some growth in drug related deaths, again, as they have in Europe. Would they have hit us as hard without Purdue and some of these other companies? I mean, I think it's a question of how much, right? Would we have 10% fewer opioid deaths? Would we have 70% fewer opioid deaths? I don't know. But when I ran the numbers, so we've, if you just imagine that single men had the same growth rate as their married counterparts, we would have seen about 40,000 fewer opioid deaths over the last decade. It's when you're talking about 100,000 a year, it's not the end all and be all, but it is a chunk, right? It's a decent chunk out of what otherwise could have been. That's 40,000 guys who are missing, could be in the labor force, could be forming families, that sort of thing. And that's just of men from I think 25 to 39, right? So there's a lot of older guys too who suffer from this. So all it is to say, there's a lot of changes that have been going on, and it's hard to control for just that one. But I do think decreasing religious adherence, decreasing community life, decreasing family formation, all of those are sort of this stew that when you add in easy availability of lethal painkillers, that really just kicks it to another gear, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I don't see any of these trends getting better right now. As far as, I mean, it seems like we're marriage rates continue to decline, and economically, if you have something, I mean, like we're fortunately don't have super high unemployment, but I would imagine if that ticked up, this would also tick up. I would imagine that would correlate pretty well with that. If you've now got people that feel like they have no purpose because they don't have a job or anything. So I don't see a lot of like trend lines in the social aspect getting better. And so what do you think? I mean, do you think the government is doing things right now, or there are things that they can do to help mitigate this? Even, I've seen people see billboards all the time now for like test strips, basically test everything because it probably has fentanyl in it, or, Narcan, as a overdose, but someone's got to be there to give you that. I mean, that's the other thing, is like we're dealing with people that are doing this and dying by themselves a lot of times. Well, Narcan doesn't help if you're the only person there. You can't administer it to yourself if you're overdosing on something. So, I mean, do you have any hope that there's good policy solutions because it doesn't sound like we can stop it really from coming in the country. We got to work on the demand and how do we save
Yeah,
people's
no, I think
lives,
that's
right?
right. And I think, you see some even, Republican presidential candidates talking about launching drone strikes or something against the cartels. And, to the point you raised, like you can produce enough, fentanyl in a basement in a house in some neighborhood in Mexico, to cover a whole state, right? And the idea that you can cut it off at the source, I think, is misunderstanding both the potency of the product and just the scale of the problem. Um, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you have to talk about supply, the demand for the drug, and restoring community would be great. Part of this problem that the improving economic picture for low income workers hasn't done anything to this, right? So that's an important. I think the some of the work that kicked this off was I mentioned my former professor Ann Case, her husband Angus Deaton came up with this framework of the deaths of despair. This idea that, look, these guys, again, run through the list of all these things. They don't have health insurance. They have a bad job. Blah, blah, blah. They're turning to this because life is so meaningless. I think the fact that we've had wage growth for low income workers and a pretty tight labor market for the last couple of years, and we haven't seen drug overdoses turn the other direction, kind of takes some of the sting out of that critique. This idea that, like, this is all just an economic phenomenon, and if only they had better jobs, they wouldn't do this. I do think that there's a proof that it's something deeper than just economics or the labor market can fix. But again, better jobs are always good, that sort of thing. You do see some, interventions that you mentioned, the test strips, you mentioned some of these things that, like, I guess sort of fall into the broad category of harm reduction. At the extreme end of the scale, you have places like Vancouver, British Columbia, and I think Portland, Oregon now, experimenting with these sort of safe sites where people can, you know, take drugs under supervision. I don't think that's really a smart way to go, because you're basically condoning it, and again, you might be able to prevent a death at a certain point in time, which is worthy of being celebrated, but unfortunately also means that you're sort of sending that signal to the rest of the people taking drugs that, oh, look, it's really not so bad. Even the city of Portland or the city of Vancouver is willing to sort of turn a blind eye to the legality of it and say, hey, look, we're going to support you. Make sure you don't OD. I don't think that does anything to do with the demand side. So, I hope that somebody can find better rehab, better ways, easier ways to kind of kick the habit if it gets started. Until that happens, I don't have any other solutions really, other than just kind of trying to increase penalties on people who are dealing. It seems like a pretty low hanging fruit kind of, and
Yeah.
then trying to restore those networks of support around people who are most susceptible to it. It's really tough work. To your point, it needs to be done by these institutions that are in the community that can speak the language of people who are suffering from this. But I really don't see any technological solution or political solution coming to our aid on the white knight, right now. So doing the hard work of trying to give people the tools to build that resiliency, so they're not turning to, drugs to numb the pain, I think is the only thing we can do in the short term, and hopefully better solutions present themselves in the medium term.
I think you're right, because I mean, it's been my entire life that we've had this war on drugs, and that was stuff that had to be grown and then processed and had to come from our
Yeah.
South. I mean, like, heroin and cocaine was all coming from. I mean, it was all coming from one border essentially, and we couldn't stop that for 40 years. And so I just don't see how we're going to stop China, who's sending this stuff via the mail and airplanes to Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. Because it really, I mean, I know Republicans, you mentioned, keep talking about the southern border and how this is like a cartel problem. And not that they're not involved in it, but it's really getting sourced from China, which means that we really have a China problem. I mean, it's like if we take out those people, they're doing it they're sending it to Canada too, and it's coming from the north border. So, there's some, I'll put a link to the DEA stats on it, but it seems like it would be impossible to stop the flow of fentanyl specifically into the U.S. So you've got to work on the demand side.
China is the sort of production hub, right, for a lot of raw materials. And
Yeah.
then once you have those, you can assemble those wherever. So yeah, a lot of the cartels get there because to your point, you don't need, if it's a poppy farm or something, you can find that on a satellite and wipe that out. Again, not
Yeah.
especially successfully, but that's been the model. If you can't do
Yeah.
that with a fully synthetic drug like fentanyl. And so yeah, I mean, it's depressing to sit here and be like, well, I don't have any great ideas, but unfortunately, nobody does. And I don't think a lot of the sort of, I just have to wave a magic wand and we'll make this problem go away rhetoric that we hear is just completely divorced from the reality of what this looks like. And unfortunately, the reality of some, again, 100,000 Americans every year ODing on this stuff. It's stopped getting worse, but it's not getting better.
Yeah, and that seems like a depressing note, but it is kind of like it is one of those problems where I think that we are. I don't want to say being lied to, but I agree. Like some of the presidential candidates saying that they're just going to like take the military into Mexico and take out the cartel. That doesn't seem very realistic in the sense that, like I said, we've had this war on drugs for a really long time, and it also seems like you whack-a-mole. I mean, it seems like you're going to take one out, and then because this stuff is so cheap, it's so easy to get, and it's so, like I said, they're sending it across. First of all, they're sending it across the actual border. They're paying off border. I mean, there's all sorts of this stuff is not just like getting snuck through tunnels necessarily. It's getting flown over, it's getting mailed over, it's getting snuck through the actual border crossings and stuff. And it seems like there's no way to stop that. And pretending that there is, I think we've got to be honest to the American people about what the problem is and what the solutions are. And unfortunately, I think you're right. In this situation, it is an individual, like it is us talking to the people we know and looking out for the people we know. But when those people isolate themselves, and I think at least I have friends that have done this and just kind of fall off the radar. You can't really, it's like you text them, they don't text you back. And you just wonder, like, what are they doing? They don't have a job. They live at home. I mean, and I do worry about those people because it's, but it's hard, at some point it's natural for us to kind of give up and go like, well, they obviously don't want to hang out. And so you stop asking them to hang out. And I think that's what we're dealing with, but I think that's going to be up to 350 million individuals to help, look at the people around them. But it's just harder when there's a lack of those community, those sources of meaning, church and bowling leagues and name it. If you're not going to those things, you're not socially interacting, and you might not think you have anything to live for. And there's obviously that side of it where it is the despair side that you're talking about. And then the accidental stuff, I mean, that just seems like something we've got to put gigantic warning signs up to kids, especially because I know I have a friend whose niece who was, I don't know, 19 or 20 or something like that, like bought something she thought was something else, and it was fentanyl, and she died. And it's like, that seems preventable, like, because that's not a despair situation, but it's only preventable in the sense that we got to tell people like, look, this is not the DARE program from the 90s situation where it's like, you're going to die if you smoke marijuana or something. Like, I think we kind of overdid some of the drug stuff with kids in the 90s, but now it really is like, look, you can think you're buying an Adderall and you will die. And so don't buy pills or take pills that were not prescribed to you, period.
It's a little bit like the boy who cried wolf, because I do think you're right that some of those 90s messages kind of went a little overboard, but now it really is the case that if you buy something on the streets, you have to treat it presumptively like it could have fentanyl in it, because it often does. It's used to lace other drugs to give it a little more, zing and people on it and have them coming back as repeat customers. That's, as you mentioned with your friend's daughter, that, this happens on a daily basis, and it's tragic. The other thing I would just say is when we're talking about, everybody who's at some point on the right side of the aisle often talks about community and intermediary institutions and Tocqueville and Bowling and all that. And that's all true, and that's all necessary. And I think it's a fundamental insight that conservatives have that we should always cherish. But the flip side of that coin is people don't come together just to come together. They come together to do something. They come together. The benefits outweigh the cost, to put it in just like Marxist economic terms. And figuring out ways, and this is something that I think policy needs to do a better job at, but we, just in our daily lives too, figuring out ways that the associations that we're part of can provide material and social and emotional and psychological benefits that can't be gotten outside of membership is a way of increasing the likelihood that people will come, right? And so, if you think about like the sort of ethnic parishes back in Philadelphia in the 1890s, or some Kiwanis or Toastmasters. These were groups that people came to because there were other people who they saw themselves as members of the community, and they were getting something out of it, whether it's life insurance or whether it's soup kitchen or
Yeah.
whatever it is. And in a world in which we all have creature comforts or a lot of it, food on the table, that sort of thing, it's harder to think about, well, what are the material benefits that we can get out of this? But I think stretching to think about these ways that we can really be putting an emphasis on hospitality and again fellowship and friendship and seeing speed dating for whatever it is, finding ways of using our membership in these organizations as intentional places to build community, and again providing benefits that outweigh the costs of membership. It's not just a sort of you show up to Little League for 2 hours and you leave, but really trying to cultivate that atmosphere of this is us doing things together as a town, as a city, whatever it is. This is why I've written about sports and some of these other things that are on one hand sort of ephemeral and don't mean a whole lot, but they also provide some sense of identity and some sense of we're all in this together. Obviously, being a sports fan is not an inoculant against drug overdoses or social isolation or anything like that. But these kind of communal celebrations and civic action that we can take, parades, whatever it is, I think those are building blocks to building an actual community that we need to be serious about and recognizing the value in, because otherwise we end up increasingly isolated, increasingly atomized, and that's bad for everybody.
That kind of brings up an interesting thought I hadn't thought of before, but you mentioned it's not as bad in some other places like Europe and stuff. And I wonder if we've kind of built the suburbs of America to be pretty isolating anyway. There's a lot of situations where you have, so I live in a neighborhood it's like downtown, it's very condensed. We see our neighbors all the time. But in our previous neighborhood, it was very common for like, I'd see someone leave out of their garage and go to work, and they might come back, pull in their garage, close the garage, and literally would never see them outside of the house other than backing their car out to drive somewhere. And, I wonder if like that might have something to do with it, because there's a little less land and space in a lot of places in Europe. And so
I'm not going to sit here and like say that's the ultimate, the silver bullet, but I do think there is something to be said.
No, for sure not.
Community life that is at a smaller scale and that is less, I'll just say car dependent. And when you get in your car and you have air conditioning, it's very easy to kind of live in that hermetic bubble. And I live in the South. A lot of people live in the South. You would be able to live here without air conditioning. It's great, but it also means you're spending a lot of time inside, and you kind of scurry to your car and you go to work and that sort of thing. Finding ways to break through that is really important. And whether that's, potlucks at the neighborhood park or Little League games or whatever it is, again, I came back to church because that's kind of, I think, the hardest to replicate anywhere else. This idea that we're all, brothers and sisters, in under God and that sort of thing. But you can do this in a secular way too. That there's been people trying to build these sort of communities, and it's hard work. But ultimately, I think this is, if you think about conservativists sort of trying to preserve the lessons that generations or thousands of years of human history have told us, it's the family is a sort of basic building block of society, right? That's where children are brought into the world.
Yes.
But families are not. I don't really like the analogy of the nuclear family, because that implies that you're self-sufficient and you're able to sustain yourself no matter, devoid of any context. And when you think about people growing up in farms or in small towns in Europe thousands of years ago, they were always interacting with others, extended family members, friends down the road, other farmers. This idea of being engaged in a web of support and having multiple points of connections across the generations. I mean, that's, I think, the ideal form of where we're supposed to be. If we don't have that, we see these social pathologies play out. And again, I don't want to idealize. It's not we have to return to the past. You can have an authentic community life in the suburbs. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah, of
But it
course you can.
requires a
Yeah.
little bit of stretch and a little bit of, willingness to make time to do that. Because when you come home and you turn on Netflix every night, it's very comfortable. I do it, yeah, of course. But
Yeah.
you're not contributing, you're not creating those spaces in your community that provide space for other people who want to be doing that. It's not a policy solution, but it is essential to
I
to
agree.
address a lot of the and partisanship and a lot of these things too that we can decry all day long, but ultimately come down to what sort of community are we building.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. Patrick, thanks so much for coming on and talking about this. I think it's obviously a really big problem and without really easy solutions, as most big problems don't have easy solutions, right? But I really appreciate it. We'll put links to the articles in the show notes, and definitely check them out and follow Patrick on all of his things.
Blake, anytime. Thanks so much.
My thanks again to Patrick for joining me today to talk about just an incredibly complicated problem without any obvious policy solutions. I know it's affected my life really personally and so many others that I know. And so I think it's an important topic to talk about. So thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please consider sharing it with someone you think might also like it. And if you want, you can follow me on YouTube and Instagram at The Homeless Conservative, as well as on Substack now, where I'm sending out a newsletter every Friday with what I think is worth paying attention to from that week in political news. Thank you again for listening. I'll catch you next time.